Okay, hi everyone. Hi, Professor Merritt. How are you doing?
I'm good, Chris. How are you?
Good, good, good. I'm doing really, really well. So thank you so much for coming on to talk to me today.
Well, please, and first call me Carrie Lee. You know we're old friends.
We're old friends, I know from college. I know. I just want to be professional. But yeah, so it's so funny that back when we were at Emory, we would often talk about a lot of these Confederate monuments and everything that sort of the history that surrounds a lot of those Confederate monuments. And now we're in this phase now in America where everyone is starting to ask those questions about the Confederate monuments. A couple of weeks, it was a couple of days ago, a couple of weeks ago, I was talking to someone about the monuments, and they said that these monuments represent my Southern heritage, and I thought that was so interesting because I was like, well, one, what does that even mean? Do you know what that means? What do you mean by what is your Southern heritage? And that made me think about your book, Masterless Men. And I think that your book is one of the best I've read in understanding what is quote unquote Southern heritage and what was the South like before the Civil War. And during the Civil War and the consequences of that, which led to after the Civil War. So, if you could just talk a little bit about what was the South like in the antebellum period? Like, what did the South look like in that period?
Right. So the South is a very diverse place, but the South that I look at is the Deep South, and those are the cotton states, mainly of South Carolina, Georgia, Mississippi, and Alabama. I don't even include Louisiana because the legal system is so different, and the racial system is so different, the caste system. And looking at the Cotton South states, though, you have states that in the 20 years before secession, a lot of those states are approaching about 50% of their population is enslaved Black people. There's a small percentage of free Blacks. But then out of the white population that's left, that is, somewhere between 50 and 60% of these states, I really divide the white people into three different classes. So there are the planters, people that own big plantations, and these are what would be multi millionaires in today's terms,
Mm,
extremely wealthy people that controlled everything about Southern society, from the legal system to the labor market. And then there's a class of, the planters are about a third of the white people in these states. And then the next third are yeomen and the burgeoning middle classes. So these are merchants, lawyers, people that are making their money off of slavery, but aren't necessarily slaveholders themselves.
mm,
Yeoman farmers owned land. Some of them did own a slave or two, but they didn't own, these big plantations. So they were middle class people, or they were people who were trying to make it into that plantation elite class. And then the last class of people, which make up the last third, really, of white people in these in the Deep South, are poor whites, people I really look at in my book. And these are people that did not own land and did not own slaves. And I argue that by the 1840s and 50s, they were pretty much cyclically poor, and kept that way because essentially they are operating on a free labor market. They are competing for jobs, mainly in agriculture, with brutalized, enslaved Black people.
hmm. Now, in your book, you talk a lot about, and this is, a lot of your book parallels with today's society. You talk about class inequality and how, like everyone's like, oh, my heritage. But it's like, well, actually, the Confederacy and the Confederates and the time before the Confederacy was actually really unequal. Like it was just like huge inequality. In your book, you say that 8,000 families basically controlled like the South and controlled the Southern, like controlled the Southern governments and controlled basically the South. Could you talk a little bit about that inequality and how that shaped a lot of the decisions that the South made, or the quote
Right.
unquote South?
Right. So that number actually comes from W.E.B. Du Bois, who
Hmm.
was one of the first scholars to ever really point out the real kind of class caste system that's operating in the South, which has always operated in the South. And in the Deep South, it was even worse because of these cotton plantations and even the sugar and rice plantations. But so this small class of extremely wealthy people controlled everything. They controlled suffrage rights. They really kind of disenfranchised many poor whites because they didn't want anybody without similar class interests to be voting. They didn't want anybody who might, be anti-slavery to be voting. And so this was really an aristocratic society, an oligarchic society with a tiny minority of extremely wealthy people controlling almost everything.
And you say in the book really that a lot of these poor whites actually did not support the Confederacy. You had like a really fascinating statistic about how like in Georgia, when they actually had the vote, they probably lost in terms of like joining, like leaving the Union by 1,000 votes, and that a lot of poor whites didn't support the Confederacy, didn't support, I mean, however they felt about slavery and being racist, but they certainly didn't like this idea of a Confederacy. Especially in the upstates of South Carolina and Georgia and Alabama, you had huge swaths of white people who were just like, no, I don't want this Confederate country to come into existence.
Right. So obviously, pretty much every single white person during this time was racist. So I don't argue anything like that, but I do argue that out of self-interest, most of these poor white people were not interested in going to fight and die for rich, powerful slaveholders who they already kind of hated. They had this class chip on their shoulder. I argue that they're class conscious, and they just want to be left alone. Most of them aren't. Some of them are unionists, especially in these areas that you're talking about, like Appalachia. There are some unionists there who really are. If they're not anti-slavery, then they at least want to remain within the Union and not break off into the Confederacy. But then most poor whites are probably really what would be termed anti-Confederates, which just means that they were not pro-South, but they weren't really pro-North either. Honestly, they didn't know enough about what was going on in the country. These were, highly illiterate people. There was no system of public education in the Deep South prior to the Civil War. Actually, the Freedmen's Bureau is what brings public education into the South for white people as well. But so they didn't really even know because of the extreme culture of censorship. I mean, this was a police society. This was a police state. We still don't understand the type of just raw brutalization on a daily basis, not just towards Black people, but towards anybody that planters and slaveholders thought could band together with Black Americans and do something to overthrow or disrupt the system.
And so it's interesting. So when I hear white people in South Carolina or Georgia say, "Oh, my heritage, my grandpappy probably fought for the war, or fought for the Confederacy, or supported the Confederacy," your book makes a good point that might very well not be true. That your grandpappy may not have fought for the Confederacy. In fact, everyone talks about the fact that the Union had to have conscription, but no one seems to remember that the Confederacy had conscription first. That the Confederacy seemed to have a shortage of men much sooner than the North did. Why do you think so many people didn't want to fight for the Confederacy? You talk about, obviously there's a class inequality, and a lot of these poor whites are kind of like, I'm not fighting for these people. But could you talk a little bit just about what that Confederate society looked like, and sort of what they were? Because in the book you mentioned the fact that the Confederates took away even more voting rights as soon as they came into power. Could you talk a little bit about how did the Confederacy itself look to these poor whites and to everybody?
They saw it for what it was. It was an oligarchic government for all intents and purposes, and it was created to serve the needs and the wants of the rich slaveholding elite. And so you don't see poor whites really joining the Confederacy, and this has now been proven from quantified methods have proven that the people that are joining the Confederacy in the first 2 years of the Civil War are all either slaveholders or sons of slaveholders, or people that are yeoman farmers about to enter that slaveholding class and still make their money some way off of slavery. So you don't see large numbers of poor whites really coming in and fighting until the Conscription Act of 1862. And and of course this is based on many other scholars like Ella Lon. We all argue that you see this vast amount of desertions in 1863. So by 1864, you've got at least half, if not 2/3 of the entire Confederate army has deserted and gone back home. And a lot of these men have gone back home, honestly, because their families are starving, right? The South, even the white South, the poor white South by 1864, they're in starvation mode. And so they're going back to try to keep their families fed and protected.
So when if I tell a white person who says to me, my grandpappy fought for the Confederacy, I could be like, well, actually, if your grandpappy actually fought for the Confederacy, they might have won the war.
Right.
Because it seems to me that, the fact that so many people abandoned the Confederacy and left the Confederacy. In fact, in your book, you talk about how there was a civil war within the Confederacy itself, because a lot of people were kind of like, no, I'm not signing up for this, and no, I'm not fighting your, rich man's war.
Right. So, right, the stupid Confederate government passes the Conscription Act in 1862. Right after, just a few months after they passed that, they passed what was called the 20 Negro Act, which exempted planters, the richest planters in the South, people that owned more than 19 enslaved people, from going to war. So at the same time, you're forcing poor men to go fight, you're exempting the richest men and their sons. And so this is when the idea of the rich man's war and the poor man's fight, really takes hold and takes shape. I do argue that there are other personal reasons that poor whites would go and fight for the Confederacy. The main one being that, especially at the beginning of the war, it was a way to earn a pretty decent living wage for the South. Like I argue is that this is a very low wage society region. It always has been. Unless something is done, on a major level, it always will be. And because you're always able to play the races off of each other in a labor market. And that's what they do, even under slavery. So they would join for a living wage. They would also join just to finally have honor. That it was a good way to earn honor in a society where they've never experienced honor. And then another issue that I think most Americans don't realize is that prior to the Civil War, all veterans of wars, of any war in America, had always been given the chance to get land. And so, land was the thing that was really land ownership was holding these poor white men back. And, the chance to have a homestead somewhere would have been incredibly appealing.
That's interesting. In your book, you also talk about the Homestead Act, and your book made me realize and rethink to the fact that, the modern Republican Party, and I think most Republicans who are watching this would be horrified at me saying this, was actually very socialist, that they believed very much in reparations through land, right? Because that's what they called for. They wanted a redistribution of wealth. They wanted land, and that the fact that the modern Republican Party doesn't want to think about this fact, but like when the Republican Party itself was founded, mostly by Black people in the South, by the way, but when it was founded in Wisconsin and in Michigan, they wanted free land. They wanted, the end of this slave society that kind of captivated and controlled the U.S. government. You mentioned that Karl Marx looked admirably on the Republican Party of the 1850s. Could you talk a little bit about like what was that early period like with the Republican Party, and what was it that they were trying to do?
I mean, you said it beautifully. They really were basically democratic socialists, and some of them were socialists. I argue that the term Black Republican, the kind of slur that they would use against, especially Lincoln at the time, that I argue that was actually a takeover of the radical red Republicans of Europe, because at this time, you don't call many people Black, you use the word Negro or something worse. So it was an adaptation of like, this is how radical these people are, that they're basically socialists, and that there's the Republican messages at this time would have been revolutionary to poor white men in the South had they actually heard of them, because they were offering homesteads in the West, free land in the West to white people. They were offering, a society of free labor where people could compete, in an economy where they could earn a living wage. And they were using imagery of slavery all of the time to argue that the white working man was actually a slave himself.
And you talk also in your book about, and Abraham Lincoln mentions this as well, but that in the South, because slavery was connected to work, a lot of poor whites actually didn't like doing a lot of hard labor because it was considered to be, slave work.
Mhm.
So could you talk a little bit about that? And also the fact that, in today's society, a lot of us think that the wealthy basically divide the races, that they know how to play the races off of one another. Could you talk a little bit as well about how the wealthy elites in the South played the poor whites off against the slaves?
Sure. So, I mean, like I said, all these poor white men had generally been agricultural workers. And
Mm,
then in the 1830s and 40s, there's what's called the Great Migration, as Virginia and Maryland and Upper South states start selling their slaves down to the Deep South, and even through the kind of Western states like Mississippi and Texas.
mm,
And as this happens, that's between 800,000 and 1 million people coming, and it basically floods the labor market. And poor white men are not desired as laborers any longer. Poor white men can talk back to a boss. They can walk off a job.
mhm,
They can't be beaten into submission. Now they were beaten, I argue, and show
right.
with a lot of historical evidence, but obviously not with the impunity that anybody essentially in the society could beat and kill Black people at the time.
Mm,
But so what happens is simultaneously, these poor white men are underemployed and unemployed. And so they kind of create an underground economy with enslaved people and free Blacks, wherein poor whites are mainly trading liquor and things that enslaved people don't have ready access to. And enslaved people and free Blacks are trading foodstuffs, corn, meat, things like that.
mhm,
So there's this whole underground economy. And of course, with that, they're drinking together, they're gambling together, they're sleeping together. There's a lot of interracial sex, and planters are losing their minds about how to
mhm,
control this and really achieve some sort of segregation in the region. And they're never able to, even though they kind of create this vast police state of
mhm,
trying to divide these people. They're never really able to. And so they become terrified of
mhm,
some sort of biracial revolt or rebellion. And there actually are instances of biracial, like small biracial rebellions all over the South all the time, where you have bands of 5 to 15, 20 people who gather together and really want to overthrow
the other.
the planter elite.
Hmm, interesting. And in your book, you say something very provocative. You say that emancipation freed poor whites. Could you talk a little bit about what that means, in terms of like how is it that emancipation, which we as African Americans celebrate, actually at that time actually freed poor whites, even more than Blacks at that time?
Mhm. Sure. And I want to preface this with, I never at any time in anything that I do ever equate what
Mhm,
poor whites went through with what enslaved or even
of
free
course.
Black people went through. There's no comparison. That there were never any white slaves. I know that that's
Mhm,
a popular, misconception that makes the round on the internet all the time. There was never any white slaves. There were indentured servants. There were people who were forced laborers because of the
mhm,
police state that they were in. But I do argue, and many other historians argue, that these people lived in basically a level of quasi freedom. It was a state of unfreedom. It was nowhere near slavery, but it definitely wasn't freedom, and it definitely wasn't anything near the kind of Jacksonian democracy that we usually hear about at this time.
mhm,
Many of these men were disenfranchised. Like I said, they had no political power, they had no labor power, they had no bargaining power. These plantations were basically monopsonies. They owned everything in a county, in an area. And so if you are on the outs with, the plantation owner, you've got no chance to do
mhm,
anything else in the society but to turn to, crime, criminal activity, some sort of underground economy. And it just creates such a level of distrust that I think slaveholders are really pushed into having to secede from the Union, because
mhm,
not only are they defending, by the 1850s, they're defending slavery not only from the North and Northern abolitionists, from the enslaved themselves. And then also this just opens up kind of a three-front battleground on slavery.
Mm. And you mentioned in your book as well about how, this is so fascinating, prisons were built for poor whites before the Civil War. And a lot of the police institutions that we think of as the police were actually built to control power against poor whites as well. And how after the war, these rich whites who basically perfected this brutal system of police and prisons basically used all of that against Black people after the war.
Right. It's
and
so that ties into, I didn't get all the way around to answering your first question. So I argue that basically Black emancipation frees poor white people in several ways. One is that they're finally competing in a free labor society, not with brutalized enslaved labor. Although again, emancipation is a process, and there are certainly many other things to make Black people into forced laborers, for more than a century later. And then they are also, they finally have free public education, like I said, through Freedmen's Bureau coming down south. They finally have free land at the same time that that people that have been enslaved for generations, that have never been compensated for anything, never given any sort of reparations, are waiting for their 40 acres and a mule, which would have served as some sort of reparations. They're denied that, while simultaneously not only white Southerners and white Americans, but white immigrants into America were given land essentially for free through the Homestead Acts. And I'm talking about land a land mass the size of both California and Texas was given away to white people for free at this exact same time that we're denying any land to people who have worked, again, generations, hundreds of years as enslaved people.
And it's interesting that so the South loses the war, whether it be because enough of them just didn't support it, but they lost the war. And immediately after that, we have these Reconstruction governments in South Carolina and Georgia. The founder of the Republican Party in South Carolina was an African American, and Texas this was African American, which would just blow the minds of most people that the founders of the Republican Party were Black in the South. And they created these biracial governments, and really, as you said, that they were the ones that founded the modern public school education system. And in school, when you and I were in school, we learned about the carpetbaggers, the scallywags, and how there was all this corruption, and how thank God Wade Hampton came here in South Carolina, and John Gordon came to Georgia and liberated us from these crazy Black people and white people working together. Could you talk a little bit about how the overthrow of those Reconstruction governments really led to these monuments? Because I think a lot of people, when they think about Confederate monuments or monuments to John B. Gordon, or here in South Carolina, we have some to Ben Tillman. In Georgia, there's Tom Watson has statues everywhere. Everything is named after Wade Hampton in South Carolina. And I think that people think, oh, well, those were Confederates. But those actually, they're not being rewarded for their Confederate time. They're being rewarded because they overthrew these Reconstruction governments. So could you talk just a little bit about the biraciality? Is that a word? I'm going to make it a word. The biraciality of the Reconstruction governments, and how those governments were overthrown by racist white Democrats.
Sure. So you're absolutely right. The early Reconstruction part, or the early Republican Party in the South, after emancipation, was completely led by Black men, really, and these were the people who had been usually literate. Most of them were free Blacks. If not, they were usually pastors of churches, so they had some access to literacy. But these were the men who came in and basically led everything. They were actively courting poor whites into the Republican government, on a very much a class basis, saying, look, all of our class interests align. We all need the same things. We're all suffering from the same hunger and want. They are proposing really, really radical reforms. I mean, truly radical. They're calling for reparations, some of them, as early, as soon as the war is over, they're calling for reparations. especially down in near where you're from, near in Savannah. You
Yeah.
know, I mean, you've got open revolt down there for years, where you've got federal troops coming in to remove some of these Black leaders. That's how radical it is. And so it's this, of course, the old planter elites and their sons start the KKK and start, inflicting as much vigilante terror on every Black person in the South, plus any white Republican, literally killing anyone that they can. I mean, it is a bloody, bloody time, but of course, because they have the resources and because they still own literally everything in the South, they're able to reassert power and control. And once the Federals are out of the South, the federal armies are gone. Unfortunately, the plantation families, the elites, their sons and daughters are still the people, and they're still today. They're still the people in control of most of the rural South. They own most of the land, most of the resources. You can trace those lineages back, to this era, because land never changed hands. And the thing about Confederate monuments is that most of them were put up by the United Daughters of the Confederacy, and that is an organization that started in 1896. And if you think about it, and most of these are put up between 1896 and the first 2 decades of the 20th century. So, 1896 to 1920 or so. And if you think about 1896, that's right when populism is in its heyday. And populism is actually a really big deal in the South, especially in certain Southern states. And you see this, again, this biracial revolt, this working class, white farmers, Black farmers, white and Black working men coming together on basis of labor and class and forming a political party. And so then this kind of idea of we're reasserting, white supremacy is all built into this kind of monuments and venerating the Confederacy, which happens at this time, to kind of create this idea of this solid white South, that slavery had always been good for all white people, that the Confederacy was, fought for nobly by all white men, which of course is not true. But they even had economic incentives. There's a great new book out by my friend Adam Dombey, and he argues that, during the 1870s, 80s, 90s, guess what? These men wanted pensions. And so even if they had not fought for the Confederacy, they're getting pensions from the Confederate government. And so all of this stuff helps to create this narrative of this, noble lost cause, that all white Southerners were united over the Confederacy.
Right. And so I think that just to show people, so from this brief period of 1865, 1866 until about 1876, there were biracial governments that were looking for revolution and change in South Carolina, Georgia, Texas, Louisiana. And the wealthy planter elites basically used white racism to overthrow those governments. And then once those governments were overthrown and the white planters took back power, took back voting rights, took back all of these rights that these biracial governments had, they built statues to honor the fact that they won the second revolution. That that these biracial governments, that these governments that were trying to do land reform, trying to give public education to the people. And so it's funny to me that everyone is like, President Trump is like, cancel culture. Why is this cancel culture? Actually, these Confederates were the first cancel culture. They were the first people, because they wanted to make sure you didn't know about Reconstruction. You didn't know about these biracial governments. You didn't know about these Black leaders. Your textbooks tell you nothing about this stuff. And the reason is because that they were the first cancel culture. The bigger the statutes and the more names that they gave to everybody, like Wade Hampton and Tom Watson, the reason why they did all of that is because they wanted to make you forget about this previous government that was actually trying to give both poor whites and former slaves rights. And so it's fascinating to me that, today's Republican Party and a lot of leaders say, well, the cancel culture of the left. It's like, well, actually, the people who built those monuments that you guys are fighting for, they were the first cancel culture.
Absolutely. And I think just one thing to add to that is that the flip side of that is that it was also part of a culture of terrorism. And it was, these monuments were put in front of courthouses mainly in order to terrify Black men at the time and eventually Black women who went to vote, because all voting at the time was done at the local courthouse. So they had to literally pass these monuments to people who enslaved them, to people who raped them, beat them, denied them, dignity and humanity for so many years. They had to pass these monuments on the way in to vote. And it's a symbol of terror. And I think that for a lot of white people, honestly, I think that once they hear how these monuments were erected and why they were erected, I think there is a shift in how they start to think about, what these mean to Black people and anybody who knows what the hell is going on in this country every day that we see them.
Right. No, and that's 100% right. I think that once people, because I think a lot of people just think, well, these are just monuments to the Confederacy. Like, what's the big deal? It's like, well, no. One, John C. Calhoun was not in the Confederacy. Two, like, the reason why they put the statue so high up facing the white side of town and his back and behind to the Black side of town was basically to tell all the Black people, hey, you know what? This is what we think of you. And we want white America or white Southerners to know that, we have their back. And so it's fascinating that I think that the history of the statues themselves are just as revealing as the person that they're honoring. So I don't want to keep you much longer. Do you have any final thoughts or final words or anything else?
Well, since we're both here in Georgia, one last thing on Confederate monuments, because I will very proudly say that we finally got ours down in Decatur, and that's something that we've been working on for years now, like historians working with the NAACP, who really are the ones who got it down. NAACP and the local, chapters of Black Lives Matter and the young activists. But one thing to think about, because I actually wrote the history of this monument. And when I went back and looked, this monument was commissioned, for people that don't know, Decatur is essentially in Atlanta, right? It's where Chris and I went to school at Emory. The Decatur monument was commissioned in 1906. Well, if you know anything about Atlanta history, 1906 was the date of the worst racial massacre in Atlanta's history, where white people went into the burgeoning Black business district of Atlanta, burned down all of their stores, looted their stores, and killed, at least, scores, if not hundreds of Black men, women, and children. Right. In order to drive them out of Atlanta and to, reassert white supremacy. And this Decatur monument was commissioned right after that. These are monuments of terror. These are monuments to keep people in their place. These are monuments to remind people that if they want to fight the power, they've got a whole hell of a lot of history to face to do that. And so I really do think that bringing these down has shown the staying power of this movement of young people. And for the first time in a long time, I'm hopeful about the situation.
No, me too. And it's so funny, down in Washington, Georgia, I think it was either Washington or Madison. The thing is, these monuments usually don't hide the ball. If you actually go up to them and read the inscription, I think the monument in Madison is this monument is dedicated to white supremacy or white women, white womanhood. Right. It is we're not hiding the ball on what we are standing for with these monuments. These monuments weren't built to honor the legacy of anybody. Even the guys out there, the Stone Mountain Monument, that wasn't built to be oh, we're just honoring Robert E. Lee and Thomas Stonewall Jackson. It's no, we're actually trying to let these Black people in Stone Mountain and in Georgia know that we're in charge, that we overthrew these other governments, and we don't want you guys to ever think that we won't leave what you're doing. So thank you so much, Carrie. This is really, really interesting. I think a lot of people are going to learn from it. So thanks a lot.
Hopefully I'll get to see you soon again, Chris. Thanks for having me.
No, thank you so much, guys. Thanks, everybody. Bye.
Bye.